In college, my wife Megan spent a semester studying in India, and she lived for a time with a host family there. And one of her jobs each morning was to go outside and to cut flowers that she brought into the mother, the woman of the house, that they placed on their home altar at their time of worship. Megan also talked about the fact that in Hinduism, there's a lot of regionalism, and in the region of India where she was, the Pune region, Ganesh is the god that many people worship there. It's an elephant-headed god who's known. People worship Ganesh whenever there's going to be a change in their life because Ganesh is believed to open up good opportunities. And she said, you could really connect with the Ganesh festival because at that time of year, when they had the Ganesh festival, there were foods that they only made at that time of year, and you didn't make it any other time. She said, it reminded me of Christmas because there are things that I love that we only make at Christmas, and to make them at some other time of year would in some senses make them not as special. We all have those family recipes that we only make at certain times of year. Indeed, as Patty pointed out, as these stories point to, we're talking today about Hinduism. We're in a series on world religions, and today we're going to take a flight a little further than, the flight's not in there again. We're just going to have to forget the flights, people. We were going to fly to India. Luckily, Lucas pointed it out for us. It's all right, because the way a screen is built, and most of our world maps have the United States over, for you all, on this side, and the rest of the world is all this way, right? And so the flight went all the way across the world because it's a flat image on a map, but it's not the way you would fly because you'd have to stop so many times to refuel. There are quicker ways to get to India heading the other direction. I want to remind you that we're talking about world religions during this series, and so we're going to learn about certain things that you may feel are not as connected to the United States. I am, for instance, as I mentioned last week, not doing a week on Judaism, even though it's the second largest religion in the United States. It is not one of the 5 largest in the world, and so I'm not doing a week on Judaism. We talked last week about Islam, which was the second largest religion in the world with, as Patty reminded us, 1.8 billion followers. And we are perhaps more familiar with Islam than we are with Hinduism, which is the third largest religion in the world. And I think that that's partially because we've become familiarized with it through radicalized versions of that faith based on experiences of violence that we have had in our own country and around the world. But Hinduism is the third largest religion in the world, as Patty shared with us. In the U.S., it is right there with Islam at about 1% of the population of the United States. So what's fascinating is while we're talking about world religions and there are all these large religions with billions of people, what you find in the United States, interestingly enough, is that the largest religions are Christianity. About 60% of the country is Christian. And then you've got 25% of people who are non-religious. That's the second largest religion, is non-religious people. And then the rest of the religions fill up. Well, sorry, I said Judaism was the second largest. Sorry. Then non-religious people are actually the second largest group. And then you have 10% or 15% that are Jewish. So that's the second largest religion, right? That's why I said that before, although it's the third largest group. And then you have all these other religions that make up sort of 1%. Hinduism, Islam, Buddhism, and other religions make up 1% each, basically. Okay, got that covered. So that 1% of Hindus in the United States is about 2.5 million, just so you know. There are 2.5 million. Just to give you a comparison, I thought that was really useful. Patty compared numbers. If you look at the United Methodists in the United States, we're 6 million, right? So that's just a comparison. They're about half the size of our solitary church. let alone the size of Christians. But it is still the third largest faith in the world, and of course the majority of Hindus are in Asia, and of course, as Patty pointed out, the largest group is in India, which has a huge population itself. Bless you. Numbers differ based on sort of time. I found a number that said about 1.2 billion worshipers. I think Patty said 1.5, something like that, of Hindus in the world. So the whole point of this series is to learn about other religions and to help us better understand what we believe, so that as we seek to share our faith in Jesus, because this is what we're focusing on this year, we've been working through our vision statement, joyfully reaching out to share God's love and faith in Jesus with everyone. We're focusing on sharing our faith in Jesus, and I think that the best way to do that is to understand our faith and understand other people's faiths so that we can meet them where they are and share our faith with them. So with Hinduism, one of the first things you should know is that Hindu is actually a relatively new term. It derived in the 1800s, but Hinduism itself is a very old religion, and it has been around since around 2000 BCE, and some people believe even earlier. There are some people that say that Hinduism is the oldest religion in the world. But the term Hindu is relatively new, and all it means is it's the name of a river in the Indus Valley. And so what's believed is actually, so while we pointed to India, the Indus Valley is actually just over the border of India into Pakistan. But that is where this religion is believed to have originated, is with an ancient culture in the Indus Valley. So in the 1800s, this name Hindu was attributed to the people, but many Hindus would not call themselves Hindus. They have other words for referring to their language. And it is very different from Christianity, or Islam for that matter, because Hinduism has no official founder and no creed. And those are two things that I was clear with Islam. They point to Muhammad, their prophet, as the founder of their faith. And I told you their basic creed, right? That there is only one God who is our God, and Muhammad is his prophet, right? Very short creed. Clearly in Christianity, we trace our roots back to a single person in Jesus Christ, and we have creeds that we've studied as a church. And so Hinduism is very different from Christianity and Islam in that it has no single person that it goes back to, and it has no creed. And it's a very varied religion across the world because it developed over such a great length of time. It is, in some ways, as one writer wrote, better thought of as a group of closely connected religious traditions rather than one monolithic faith. And so it's sometimes hard to talk about Hinduism because the practice of one Hindu person and the practice of another it varies. So, for instance, let me say this. I mentioned in the very beginning that Megan was in charge of gathering flowers that were put on the altar. This is common practice in Hindu culture to have a home altar where you worship. But what's interesting is I was looking into, how often do you worship at this home altar? And this varies greatly. Some people would only do it once a month. Some would do it once a week. Some do it once a day. I found other people who said, no, if you're a true Hindu, you worship at your altar 3 times a day, and there's nothing acceptable that is less than that. So that shows you some of the variety that exists in this religion. Still, even though it is varied, it has some common beliefs. There is this idea called Brahman, and we sometimes call it a god, but more realistically, the way that Hindus would describe it is as a power. It is the power that binds the whole universe together. And it's sometimes easier for us, because we worship gods, to think of Brahman as a god, but it really is a power. And then another common belief among almost all Hindus is the idea of samsara. Samsara is this idea that we are born and we die and we are reborn again and again and again. It involves the idea of reincarnation, which you may be familiar with. It may be a word that you have heard. Within samsara, this cycle of birth, death, and rebirth, birth, death, and rebirth, and this just continues over and over and over again. You live, you die, and you are reborn again. Now, of course, we could spend a lot of time talking about you're not always born as a human. You come back in different life forms, and that's a part of the belief of samsara. That is based largely on this idea of karma, a word that you may also be somewhat familiar with. What's fascinating is while there are not a lot of Hindus in our country, the ideas of Hinduism have really come into our culture in many ways. And so there are many words that we're somewhat familiar with. Karma is the idea that what we do in this life affects the future lives that we will have in that samsara cycle. And so if you live a bad life, the idea is that you come back as a worse off life form, probably a mosquito, right? They do have this final belief. It's a fairly newer belief in the sense, remember, this is a religion that's over 5,000 years old. And so newer in the sense that it's only a couple thousand years old. There's this idea of moksha, which means release. You can be released from this cycle of birth, death, and rebirth, birth, death, and rebirth, birth, death, and rebirth. So those are general beliefs that all Hindus believe. And then there are additionally goals in life. There are 4 of them. Virtuous living, which is translated from a word that, again, many of you may be familiar with, which is dharma. That's virtuous living, so living a good life. To profit or have worldly success is a second goal in all Hindus' lives. And to enjoy the pleasures of this life is a third goal of all Hindus' lives. And then the 4th one is that idea of moksha, being released. That release comes from ultimate enlightenment. That's when you achieve moksha. So, how do Hindus worship? I mentioned that they worship in their home, and this is most often the case. They have home altars that they set up to their personal, essentially that's the best way to put it. Most families, and this would be passed down through generational pieces, most families have a personal god that they prefer to worship. As I mentioned, it's sometimes regional, and so Ganesh is a very popular god in Pune, which is a province of India. So sometimes it's regional, but also certain families will have affinities, and then people personally can have affinities toward certain gods within the Hindu religion. There are numerous different gods within the Hindu religion, and so people find one that they resonate with, and they set up an altar that they then make offerings to as an act of worship. So it can include flowers, fruit, other things that are important that you think that God would enjoy. The idea is that you are inviting the god into your home, and so you're the host, and you are providing for them as a guest, and so you offer hospitality to them. That's different than a Christian understanding, right? When we have the table here where we take bread and juice, which we just did last week, what I always say is this is not my table, this is not your table, right? This is God's table. We're the ones who are the guests, right? In Hinduism, the idea is that you're inviting God as a guest to your home. There are temples as well for Hindus where they go and worship in groups. And this is most often done at special occasions. However, you will find that in the United States, Hindu temples frequently have weekend worship. This is because as Hindus came into our culture and wanted to sort of assimilate the best that they could, they noticed that all of the religions here had a weekly meeting together. And so while you may not necessarily experience that if you met Hindus across the world, you may find out that a Hindu temple here has a regular weekly gathering, often on a Sunday, in order to sort of match our culture. In worship, when they go to the temple, and even at home, they take their shoes off as a sign of the fact that they are on holy ground. And I really like that because we have this idea in our own faith, which I'll talk about more in a little bit. And then I forgot to mention it last week, but we are putting up a symbol of the religion each week. Last week, the symbol of Islam is a crescent moon and a star. The crescent, just so you know real quickly, the crescent is a symbol of growth because from there the moon just grows, right? And then the star symbols enlightenment. This symbol is a Sanskrit word which is Om. And again, You may have been familiar with karma and reincarnation and dharma. Om is something you may be familiar with as well. It's a sound that people use when meditating, and meditation has made its journey over into our culture, obviously. Om is understood to be the beginning sound of creation. It is the sound that was present when the world began, basically. Isn't that interesting? I never knew that until I did more studying for this sermon. But that's the way that it's written in Sanskrit. That's the word or the sound, Om. Now, as I mentioned, Hindus have a lot of gods and is tended to be referred to as a polytheistic religion because of that. However, we do run into some problems with that because some Hindus, again, because it's a varied understanding, they would argue that it's not necessarily polytheistic. But in general, there are a great number of gods, and we would probably label it as polytheistic. And so I wanted to mention why we read the story that we read today. A good, long story, as I said, but also a really good story. If you paid attention, you heard a story of Elijah, one of the prophets of Judaism and of our faith, who challenges this group of priests who represent another god, Baal. And he challenges them to a duel, basically, of the powers of God. It's one of my favorite stories, because it's this competitive aspect, and I'm naturally competitive. If you've ever worked pasties with me, you know that I will try to prove that I can do it faster and better than you do. I'm just competitive. So I love this story because it's competitive. I also love this story because it has some of the humor that I often talk about in the Bible. You didn't hear it today because, again, we so often like to translate things out of the Bible that make us uncomfortable. What you heard Arnie read today is, so there's a moment when Elijah, the priests of Baal are trying to get their God to burn up their sacrifice, and it's not working. And Elijah makes fun of them. He says, at one moment, what Arnie said is, perhaps your God is busy. This is a euphemism that we translate because what it actually says in Hebrew is, perhaps your God is going to the bathroom. This is how Elijah is teasing these people. He says, perhaps your God is busy eating. Maybe he's going to the bathroom. Maybe he's fallen asleep and you need to wake him up. It's actually pretty mean. That may tell you a little bit about me as you also hear me saying that this is one of my favorite stories in the Bible, right? I do like to tease people and sometimes a little too aggressively, right, Sandy? Yeah. So, what's interesting is that, in this story, this is a group of people who worship a different God, and that's why I wanted to read it, because in Hinduism, they are worshiping other gods. But, while I said I've always understood this as a story of competition, what I really realized as I read the story in preparation for this sermon is that it's about showing the power of God. And I actually, for the very first time, found myself thinking, Elijah teases them and makes fun of their God. I don't think that that's a useful way to actually convert people. And actually, that's not what happens in this story. Elijah's not trying to convert the people who worship Baal. He's trying to convert the Jews who have begun to worship Baal as well, and to say to them, look, you need to stick with the true God. And what happens at the end is that all the Israelites bow down and say, oh, it is true that our God is the true God. So even, I don't think, I said last week that the goal here is not to condescend, and I do think that Elijah clearly, by saying, is your God asleep? Is he just going to the bathroom? Is a little condescending, right? I don't think that that's our goal as we seek to share our faith. I do think what Elijah does here is show the power of God, and we can be people who show the power of God in our lives. So I said, Hinduism is polytheistic in the most technical of terms, but there are people that would argue with that. And in fact, Megan, again, telling me about her time in India, said, I met a woman who said, everyone says that Hinduism is polytheistic, but actually I think of it as more akin to the Christian understanding of the Trinity, which is that you say you have one God, and yet you have these three representations of God. And she said, my belief is that there is Brahman, which I said is this power, right? And we sometimes say is a god. And then there are all these different representations of Brahman that come in these gods that we have named. You know, we may begin to split hairs at that point, but it's an idea that I ran across in multiple places as I prepared for this week. The idea that it may be perhaps unfair to call Hinduism polytheistic in a true sense because all of these gods are an expression of Brahman. At the same time, you also will run across the fact that, out of that thought, you'll run across the idea of the Hindu Trinity I ran across, because there are three main gods or expressions of Brahman, and those are Brahma, not to be confused with Brahman, which has an N at the end. There was a physical manifestation at some point of God that they named Brahma. There's Vishnu and there's Shiva. And I mentioned these three because I talked about samsara, right? This cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. These three represent for them the creator, that's Brahma. Brahma was the one who created at the beginning of time. Vishnu is the one who preserves creation. And Shiva is the destroyer, the one that comes to destroy creation. I saw that it referred to as the Hindu Trinity. I don't know that that's necessarily an idea that Hindus would subscribe to. I thought it was interesting, though, because Megan had told me this story where this woman said, I often think of it in the Christian understanding. Now, of course, we would have to get into fine details of theology there, because for us, it's not, for them to say that these different gods are different expressions of the God is not actually a useful way for us to talk about the Trinity. The Trinity is really hard to talk about. I told you this last week. When engaging with Muslims, it's the hardest thing for them to understand because they say, you tell us that you worship one God, but it sure doesn't seem like it. But we hold that, yes, no, this is one God, that in some sense, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit are no different from each other, that they are the exact same thing. And yet, we experience them differently, right? So it's a little bit hard to explain sometimes. So, many gods, potentially, though, not truly polytheistic if you think of Brahman as that overarching one God. And it depends, again, on what Hindu you're talking to, how they would feel about that. They have religious writings. The most common are the Vedas. There are 4 of them. Off of the Vedas came the Upanishads, which are sort of philosophical writings. The Vedas are poetic writings of creation and things like that. There's also the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. And the most famous part of the Mahabharata is the Bhagavad Gita, which you may have heard of. This is sometimes called the Hindu Bible. Because the Bhagavad Gita is a poem that tells the story of God interacting with humans. You heard Patty mention diet. They, in particular, refuse to eat, all Hindus, as far as I know, refuse to eat beef because they honor the cow as the most important animal out there. And in fact, not only will they not eat beef, they'll often decorate cows, and you'll see people caught in traffic in India because there's a cow in the road and they are not allowed to shoo it and move it along. It is a holy animal and it must be there for a reason, and we're just going to have to wait until that cow decides to move along, right? They are holy animals, which is not something that we're familiar with, right? We don't necessarily view, we certainly don't view cows in the same way. And then you heard Patty mention some other dietary differences as well. So those are some of the things about Hinduism, and some of them feel very different, but what does feel familiar? Well, I mentioned that when they worship, they take off their shoes, and I love this because in the Old Testament, when Moses meets God, what God instructs him to do is to take off your sandals, because right now you're standing on holy ground. I love, there's some sort of connection where I love summertime because it's a time when I do tend to go outside barefoot more often. And do you all know that feeling? There's just something about it. You do feel more connected in some way to everything that God has created, right? And these things that we wear tend to separate us from the world. So, the fact that God says to Moses, I want you to remove your shoes because you're on holy ground. I love that idea. We wear our shoes into worship. Maybe we should take our shoes off. They talked about, so there are these different gods. Again, if it's polytheistic versus monotheistic, it's a little unclear depending on which Hindu you ask. But certainly what they do have is different ways of experiencing God, right? And we have that as well in the experience of God as Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. You heard Patty say, of course, living a good life is a good thing. And dharma, this idea of virtuous living, yeah, how could we argue with that? The goal is to have a life that is based in moral standards, right? And that's what virtuous living means, to have moral standards. And I think this, I said that Hinduism is varied. And as a faith around the world, Christianity is also just as varied. It's just that what we've done is broken ourselves off. Hindus, sort of across the board, accept all of these differences among the worshipers in their faith. And we tend to say, oh no, I don't like what you're doing, so we're going to go off and start our own group of worshipers, right? But we still are just as varied. And I wonder if perhaps we could begin to view the differences among worshipers in Christianity in the same way, right? Could we see that some things are of ultimate importance, and if you say that that's true, I guess we can't really be the same faith, but that there are a whole lot of things that perhaps are not that dire, and we might be able to accept one another around them? I don't know, but I sort of value the variety in Hinduism and the fact that it still, though, is viewed as one world religion, even though there are differences. What differences do we experience between Hinduism and Christianity? Well, clearly this idea of reincarnation and karma. You'd be surprised. I told you that some of these ideas have entered our culture, and reincarnation is one of those big ones. And I have a lot of people in my career as a pastor who have said to me, I think reincarnation is really interesting. Don't you think that that's possible? And I say, sorry, as a Christian, that's not what we believe, right? It just isn't the same belief. And karma, the idea that what we do in this life will affect however we are reborn, that's also not an idea. Jesus addresses this specifically when the people come to him with the blind man and say, who was it that sinned, this man or his parents, that he's born blind? And Jesus says, that's not how it works. That's the idea of karma, that somehow someone did something bad and this guy is blind now because of that. We don't hold to that belief. It's different. Jesus brings grace, and God offers grace so that we're not trying to live a good life so that our next life will be better. We are living a good life because God has redeemed this life for us. That's the difference in our faiths. But I do think that there could be value in some of the differences as well. And particularly, I love that Hindus worship at home. I wish that Christians did this more often. The reality is, more often than not, we come to church on Sunday, we figure that we have worshiped for the week, and we go about our lives. Hindus, in a technical sense, as I mentioned to you before, are supposed to worship at home on a daily basis, and as Patty mentioned, the mark of the bindi is a reminder that God should be always present in your mind. We try to teach this in our faith, but I'm not sure that we always do very well at actually having times of worship at home. And so I found myself, as I pondered Hinduism, thinking, what can we learn from this faith? That might be one of the most important things, that we could find ways as a church to really worship together at home on a regular basis. So, we read this story about Baal and Elijah calling down fire from God. I love this story, as I told you, because it does show the power of God. Elijah takes the altar and on top of that dumps water on top of it until it is filling a trench around it. And we're told that God still can burn up that sacrifice. But I do think, as I mentioned, that our goal is, as we go out into the world and as you potentially meet a Hindu person, is not to condescend, but instead to show the power of God. That's what Elijah does ultimately in this story, is shows the power of God. How do we do that as we engage with people of different faiths? We do that by showing the power that God's had in our lives. And we do that through showing a changed life, right? Living differently. The Hindus do it in order to affect the next life. We do it because we have been changed and we know the power of the God that we worship. We can share that and show that to people as we go out to share faith in Jesus with others. And I started off by saying that we are very different, and that is true. We are different from Hindus. But I think when we go out into the world to share our faith, what we need to focus on is not where we are different, but where we are similar and have things in common. Because anytime we focus on the differences, we tend to push away and ostracize, right? That is always how it's been. It's what's going on often in our culture right now as we're saying, oh, we are very different than that group and we're just going to have to separate from them and be apart from them. You better come over and join us, right? But the reality is if we could look at what we have in common and show people God's power, we might actually share faith more effectively than if we are constantly pushing people away, pointing out how different they are than we are. Yes, Hinduism is very different as a religion. Turns out that it's very different from one another across the world. It's kind of how this religion is. But there are touch points of similarity for us as Christians. And I think that those are the places where we could meet people and show God's power in our lives so that they might see the power of God and be converted. Amen.